Joining me is the former Foreign Minister of Australia, former Labor Premier of New South Wales as well. Bob Carr, thank you very much for your time. What do you make of the announcement today? I know you've been critical of the lack of detail around a target, but the government has got there, at least when it comes to a 2050 target. Will that fly at COP in Glasgow?
Yeah, well, we had no alternative to do that. It would have been a diplomatic outrage if Australia had turned up at this conference of the parties and said, defying the rest of the developed world, that we weren't accepting an appropriate responsibility. So the developed country that has more emissions per head than any other would have stood out as the only developed country not making a commitment to net zero emissions in 2050. So it wasn't an option. And I wonder what the National Party thought it was on about if they imagined that their country, that our country, could have stood out from all our partners and indeed the rest of the developed world. So the government simply had to get there. It's a reflection on the Prime Minister's leadership that he did so in such a crabwise movement, and it took so long.
It did take quite a long time, but as you know, as well as anyone, Bob Carr, this has been a difficult issue for both sides of politics federally. At least he's landed a deal with some clarity. There's been criticism about the lack of detail. There's been criticism around the lack of ambition. But at least it's a deal he can take to Glasgow with his cabinet behind him.
Yeah, Kieran, I'd say there was no alternative, that any Australian leader who couldn't produce this would have felt moral pressure to have given up the job. Every other developed country was there with that net zero emission by 2050 commitment. And the nations we're closest to, indeed, take the recent geostrategic positioning of Australia with the UK and with the US and over submarines, have decidedly more ambitious targets for 2050 than we do. This was the bare minimum we could have done. The focus will be on what we're offering by 2030, and it stands out to the world that the government is going to Glasgow with no more ambition than Tony Abbott laid down. Tony Abbott laid down 5 years ago. So it's not an impressive performance, and those of us who think that Australia should be cutting a reputation in the world as a creative, a smart and affluent middle power, providing global leadership, are really undermined by this stance by our government. And the people who deserve to be angriest, I think, are Australia's youth, who are looking at a government that is falling a long way short of what is seen by the world as the bare basic minimum standard. Why can't Australia, given the enterprise of business leaders like Twiggy Forrest and Michael Cannon-Brookes, the leadership of the boardrooms, BHPs, Rios, going well beyond what the government's doing, the Business Council of Australia saying we ought to have ambitious targets for 2030, and indeed I give credit to coalition governments, state governments in New South Wales and South Australia for saying the same thing, 50% reductions in emissions by 2030. Australia doesn't look that good, and I tell you where it hurts. It hurts not only with our allies who are thinking that there's something a bit odd about a country that can't measure up in this way, but with the 14 nations of the South Pacific. An admiral from Fiji put it very well a year ago when he said the competing forces for power in the Southwest Pacific are America and China and climate change. And climate change is winning.